AM FM radio reaches more 18 to 34-year-olds than Facebook, than Instagram, than Snapchat, than Twitter, than WhatsApp, than LinkedIn. All those social media tools that get a huge amount of money, colossal amounts of advertising dollars, don't even come close to what radio does with millennials, let alone the entire population.
I want to welcome you to my sales podcast, where we have one focus and one focus only. That is helping you, the sales community, and sales leaders create more conversations with more qualified buyers, ultimately leading to improving your sales productivity and closing more deals. Each show, you will hear from sales leaders, practitioners, and influencers to help you find, engage, and connect with more buyers. I'm Mario Martinez Jr., and you're now listening to the Selling with Social Sales Podcast. Selling with Social Podcast listeners, boy, oh boy, I've got another first for you. You have no idea. And the first is I've got somebody who's going to be talking about radio sales. They're in the radio industry. This is the first on the Selling with Social podcast, and I'm pumped. You know why? Because this individual coming up on our show is actually featured in the Modern Sales magazine in the top 100 global sales leaders as identified by the Modern Sales magazine. I'm actually honored to be in the magazine with him as one of the top influencers. And I had to reach out to all these sales leaders and say, I got to get you on the show. So without further ado, Rafe D'Amico, an industry leader and a senior vice president in the radio industry of sales. Rafe, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Mario. Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be talking to you.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I mean, like I said, it's the first time in actual Selling with Social history, over 100 episodes, and I've never had anybody from the radio industry. Now, those people listening right now, leaders from technology or anybody who's listening in sales, leaders, sales reps, you're going to want to listen to this whole entire show because we're going to talk through some really important things. Commodity-based challenges, competitive challenges, and then how to level up. Whether or not you are in radio or not, this is going to be really interesting, a really fun show. So do me a favor, man. Tell everybody about yourself. Tell them a little bit about your background. You've obviously been in sales. You're a senior vice president of sales. You're in the global top 100 sales leaders. Congratulations at that as well.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened, but I mean, it does kind of, back up a little bit. It begs the question, how come I'm the first radio guy, Mario? What's up with that? I mean, you're a podcast guy. You're in the audio business. I mean, radio's kind of like a brother or sister of the podcast world. I mean, I'm feeling some neglected love here, man.
That's true, man. You speak truth. But I tell you what, I haven't had anybody that could fit the profile. That was good looking enough to be on the show. There you go.
All right. Yeah, I hear you. So, to answer your question, I've been in media essentially. I was almost like born into it because my family was in the business. My dad worked for CBS radio. My mom worked for NBC television and Comcast. I have an uncle who works in the outdoor industry. I grew up around all sorts of media. I was doing internships when I was in high school in the summertime. Grew up in Philadelphia. Grew up in the suburbs of Philly, and did some internships out that way with Handwritten Media. And then I went to the University of Arizona and I studied in media arts there. It was almost like I didn't have a choice, but I love it. I'm really happy where I am. It's been an interesting 20 years. A lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, we can take a past look at that 2-decade period and see what got us to where we are now and the challenges that we face and just how much disruption has happened in the media space as a whole, and then specifically how it relates to radio. And I think a lot of salespeople, a lot of industries can probably find things to relate to, whether it's because of how they deal with media, how they consume media, or how it's similar or parallels to something with sales in their industry. I think it's a competitive space, but a very rewarding space.
Yeah. Now, people listening in, and when you and I talked in the pregame show, I had some notions in my own mind. Like, I rarely ever listen to the radio, right? And I want you to comment on that
Don't
now, because
say
you had,
that.
yeah, no,
Don't
no,
say that.
but this is interesting though, because you made me be like, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't realize something else is there. Like my own mindset was just wrong about this. But before we have you answer that one, I want you to tell everybody something about yourself that nobody would know by looking at your social profiles.
I know you like to ask this question, so I did my
I want
homework.
something juicy, man.
Yeah, well, I got something juicy for you. Actually, I've got grape juice.
All right.
I'm talking about fermented grape juice. So a whole like kind of side passion project of mine is I have my own wine label. It's called Ozymandias Wines, and it's a purely philanthropic endeavor. I mean, it raises money for emerging artists. Literally 100% of every penny that comes in is given back to the art community. There's actually a scholarship in the name of Ozymandias Wines with the New York Academy of Art. I'm based in New York now, so I kind of focus on my backyard as I'm growing this mission, so to speak. It's great wine. It's grown. It partners with a winery out in the North Fork of Long Island, as well as some growers out in Santa Barbara, California, out in your neck of the woods, maybe. We've got some great wine, and we do some big events. We do some fundraisers. We donate a lot of wine to artists and art galleries. And then the wine that we sell online at ozymandiaswine.com, that revenue is all given back to artists in the form of scholarships. And like I said, with the New York Academy of Art, really well-renowned school. Andy Warhol was part of some of the founders there. So I love it. It gives me a lot of joy. It's something to give back. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely some sales obstacles that I faced there. It's a whole different story that, maybe we can talk about as we get into some of these topics.
Yeah. Now, we'll have the website link for the wine in the show.
Awesome.
But do me a favor, Rafe, spell out ozymandiaswine.com. Can you spell out the website?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. So it's OZY, M as in Mary, A, N as in Nancy, DIAS, followed by wines, WINES.com.
There you go. So we'll make sure we put that into the show notes for all of you. But what you don't know is I have the privilege of having a little sippy right now. What are we drinking right now? What are we drinking right now,
Yeah,
Ray?
Look at you. Yeah, I mean, hey, it's late Friday, early Friday evening, let's call it. I mean, and you could certainly say it's 5 o'clock somewhere, but yeah, I'm enjoying a little bit of vino myself. So I'll give you a virtual cheers, Mario. Salud. I wish you a blessed weekend and a blessed summer, man.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. Well, you all got to try it, and it's for a great cause, a really great cause, especially for the arts program. So listen, let's get into some meat here. Let's talk a little bit about the radio industry as a whole. Now, I said earlier, when I think about radio, I was like, man, I don't want commercials. I don't want to listen to the radio. But for me, you opened my eyes to something that was like, whoa, I had no idea what was going on with the state of the radio industry. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's two different things there. Let's start with the state of the industry, and then we'll get into what you were talking about there, and how I was kind of talking about that myopic lens that I like to call it, that we all view the world through our own personal experiences, but then specifically how that relates to the buyers in the media world, the media agencies who do the buying and those personal experiences. But the state of the industry, we are looking at a very mature business. If you look at the life cycle of a business, radio's maybe 65, 70 years old. It's not a startup. It's not that, young 20-year-old coming out, just getting started and full of a lot of energy. And even though, like, you look at these companies, the young companies that have tons of revenue coming in, but they're not necessarily making money, but they get everybody excited just because of the colossal amounts of revenue that are coming in. Radio isn't in that growth mode. The revenue associated specifically with radio, and now I'm going to narrow that down just to like AM, FM, what some people like to call terrestrial radio. That revenue stream is plateauing at best and mildly declining. So these radio companies, broadcast companies have to adapt and evolve and look at different ways to make money. But AM, FM is still your bread and butter. That's what's driving the bus still, so to speak. So even though it's very mature, it's still very important to the survival of the companies. And radio companies still have incredible margins. Like, these are businesses that Wall Street fell in love with because you have some stations that operate 40, 50% margins. I mean, they are just absolute cash cows. So Wall Street, being Wall Street, licks their chops, sees that and says, how can we buy as much of these as possible? You combine that with the consolidation that happened directly before the housing crisis, and you get an interesting recipe where now all of a sudden these Wall Street companies are over-levered on the debt that they have associated with all the radio stations. And, it's like the same thing that happened with a house. If somebody bought a house that was worth, let's say, $1 million, and now all of a sudden that $1 million house, after the housing crisis happens and the bubble comes down, that house is only worth $700,000, and your adjustable rate mortgage is going up. You've got an asset that's depreciating, you're underwater on it, you maybe can't afford your mortgage, and you're in trouble. So that happened with a lot of radio stations. That's why you see companies like iHeartMedia, who went through a Chapter 11 restructuring. Cumulus went through about a year ago, just came out of a restructuring. So you had an industry that had to get healthy and is getting healthy. But because of some of those Chapter 11s and some of those restructuring of debt that was going on, the reputation on the outside was maybe one that could be a little negative. And then you combine that with the fact that it's no longer the shiny new toy. Radio's been around for a long time, and the rumor of radio's death is greatly exaggerated, and radio's death has potentially happened numerous times. If you look back to when even tape cassettes were put into vehicles, everybody said, oh no, this is it. Radio's dead. They're done. People are no longer going to listen to the radio. People can just put in whatever music they want to listen to. This is going to kill radio. We all know that didn't happen. Same thing with CD players, especially then, like, well, now you can put 6 CDs in a trunk. Like, people are they don't have to like change their music now. They can put a whole like bunch of songs and different albums in. Radio still remains strong. And, like the latest killer of radio is, of course, actually even back up. Then satellite radio came out, XM and Sirius and all that. And it's like, oh, and, radio without commercials. And then Howard Stern left. He's the biggest radio jock. Like, it didn't even really nudge the revenue. It barely moved it. And more importantly, it didn't change the listening habits. And the same can be said for the way that Pandora and Spotify and other like digital streamers, they're definitely disruptors in the space. Let's make no doubt about that. And radio needs to pay attention, and radio is paying attention, and they're doing their own version of digital. And we'll get into that later when we talk maybe about some disruption. But it didn't change the listening habits. So a couple of things I want to touch on with that. One is radio is the largest mass reach medium available in the US, even more than TV now. And that's the perception that a lot of people don't have. That's one of those like misperceptions we were talking about. Radio reaches about 92%. It's actually 93% of adults 18 plus every single week. So you can think about that.
So radio reaches 93% of adults who are 18 years or older in the US. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you're probably hearing me say that and thinking like, oh, I don't believe it. I don't buy it. This is a Nielsen statistic. It's like Nielsen is, as you probably know, and a lot of people listening to the show know, they're the gold standard.
Yeah. Everybody uses Nielsen and their stats, right? Now, so what's interesting to me, you said something earlier. You gave an illustration that, the tape came, it didn't kill radio. The CD came, it didn't kill radio. Sirius radio, XM radio came, didn't kill radio. Now we have a digital disruption that's taking place, which is, the ability to be able to listen to music the way you want to listen to music. Amazon Prime Music, right? You've got Spotify, you've got iHeartRadio, like all these things like Pandora, right? All these things that I think of as the common technology that we're utilizing on our phones. But I also I live in San Francisco area, so it's probably common. But if I were to travel out, I don't know, a few hours outside of San Francisco, guess what? I mean, we have a totally different dynamics, and not everybody lives in San Francisco proper. So I would assume that these are that there's got to be something else that the rest of the Americans are listening to. And in this case, according to your stat, guess what? Everybody's listening to radio. So that's an interesting to me. But do you think that the digital disruption, I mean, I think you said this earlier, that it's definitely a disruptor. Do you think that digital disruption could be the demise of AM/FM radio?
Who knows? A few decades from now, perhaps, even 10 years from now. But right now, I can, without a doubt, 100% tell you no. And it's not going to change anything dramatically in, let's say, like the next 5 years. Because number one, like I just told you, you have that people are still listening to radio. It is a free product. Listening habits are going to change. And we really now look at our industry as the audio industry.
Yeah.
So radio is just one part of that. AM/FM radio is just one part of that. All broadcasters now are really looking at themselves as audio companies. And like I mentioned, they have their digital streaming offerings. Podcasting is massive and the latest new shiny toy that everybody wants to play with. But it kind of goes back to, I'm going to share a quote with you by Mark Ritson. He's a marketing professor. And he said, there's an increasing global evidence that marketers are basing their media choices on their own behavior, or that stoked by the digitally obsessed marketing media rather than actual audience data. The first flaw of marketing is that you are not the market. You are an urban professional, well-paid media executive. Everything you think and do is from a highly unrepresentative point of view.
That's so true, because when you and I were talking, I was like, yeah, you know what? That's my own personal consumption from, and as I mentioned earlier, from urban San Francisco area, right? As a leader in this particular area, I have a very myopic viewpoint, and what I think is going on is, well, quite frankly, what should be happening across the rest of the world, but it's not. Right?
Yeah. So I have news for you. It's worse than New York City. It's 10 times worse in New York City, because guess what? All those media buyers and media planners, especially the younger ones, they're all taking the subway.
Yeah.
They are all taking the subway. They're not driving cars like the rest of the country is. I'll share another statistic with you. 86% of Americans drive a car or truck to work. That is their means of transportation. That is their commute to work. It's 146 million Americans. And what else is even more interesting about that is, of those 146 million Americans that are driving vehicles to work, 89% of them are doing it alone. Meaning, like, they're in a vehicle, they're in a captive environment, they're having a conversation with themselves, they're having a conversation with their radio, which, really speaks to like the intimacy of the medium. But you go back to the way that media buyers and media planners are actually looking at the product. There's a huge gap between the perception and the reality of audio listening. And I don't think it's ever been bigger. And we wanted to do some studies on this to figure out what was going on. So, it's like every company has a form of marketing. And if you want to think about who your decision makers are, whatever you're selling, whatever your industry is, it's really important to know how they view the world that you're involved in. So we asked a lot of these media buyers and supervisors and planners what they thought the audience share was of AM/FM radio compared to Pandora and Spotify. So we were able to compare the perception that they have versus the actual reality. So the perception was that 36% of all audio listening, the share was with AM/FM radio. AM/FM radio accounted for 36% of all listening. That's the perception. They thought that Pandora, their slice of the pie, was 21%. And they figured Spotify is a little bit better than Pandora. They're a little more successful. Spotify's got 23% of the total pie of audio listening.
Right.
Well, here's the reality. That the slice of the pie for radio, for AM/FM radio only, is actually 46%. So it's half. 46% versus 36%. Now, here's where it really gets interesting. that Pandora slice of the pie that they all thought was 21% of the whole
right.
is actually four single digits, 4%.
Wow.
Spotify is even less. 23% was a perception. And the reality is that it accounts for 2% of all the listening.
Wow.
So, I mean, you talk about having a myopic view. I mean, that breaks it down in a very like palpable way right there.
Talk about some myth busters, right?
Yeah, seriously. And another big myth buster is, okay, well, what about millennials? You know, like 18 to 34-year-olds don't listen to radio. And when they get older, you guys are dead. Well, that's not true either. And again, you can't just think about what's going on in your city and the people that are in your circle. What is going on in the rest of the country? What is going on with people in different like economic socio-class than where you are? And AM/FM radio still reaches 91% of all millennials. Facebook only reaches 75% of millennials, 18 and 34-year-olds. Think about that. AM/FM radio reaches more 18 to 34-year-olds than Facebook, than Instagram, than Snapchat, than Twitter, than WhatsApp, and LinkedIn. All those social media tools that get a huge amount of money, colossal amounts of advertising dollars, don't even come close to what radio does with millennials, let alone the entire population.
So you mentioned earlier, though, that the digital format has definitely created some disruption, right? And
absolutely.
Talk a little bit about some of the challenges that have happened to the industry, because I think this is important to parlay the challenges that you guys, not you guys, but the radio industry is facing, period, because that actually goes right back into the sellers. Like whether you're in technology, whether you're in insurance, whether you are in radio, doesn't matter. It goes back into some of the same challenges that I face today when we sell into an organization. Talk a little bit about that.
Competition has increased significantly since I was first in the business. So, you know, it's like what we would call fragmentation of just, you know, media consumption, where you were maybe just competing with print, TV, cable, you know, radio and outdoor. Now you throw in all sorts of stuff. I mean, you've got social media, you've got search, you know, you've got event marketing playing a much larger role than it used to. All these different forms of media are competing for the same dollars. It's not like companies are waking up and saying, hey, I need to keep spending more and more on advertising and more on marketing. Even competing with like the yellow pages, which used to be big and now like is kind of gone away to search. So many different companies are fighting for that same media dollar. So fragmentation is huge. We still need to be aware and alert of any potential ratings erosion, as much as like it's powerful to be able to tout that we reach 93% of the US population 18 plus in a given week. You still have to be aware of listening habits. I mean, like in your home market of San Francisco, you definitely have a lot more ratings compression there for like the different radio stations that are out there. They're sharing more ratings. You know, like the gap between one station and the next is so microscopic now. It's a tenth of a rating point, where maybe before it was like 0.5 of a rating point. And this is where technology has changed some things, where Nielsen used to measure ratings by a diary. Somebody would literally fill out a diary and have to recall what they listened to. And, you know, nobody's going to be perfect with recall. Now it's a PPM, a personal people meter, which, you know, is electronic, is very accurate. Statistics are involved, and there are a few thousand meters in any given market, depending on the size, and they represent the allegedly and accurately. I mean, I'm no statistic math genius. The guys at Nielsen certainly are, and you know, like they have certain PPMs representing every tiny little single demographic down to gender, age cells, zip codes, to make sure that they're representing a given, you know, metro appropriately. But the accuracy of that ratings measurement has shown some ratings erosion, because you have somebody who would maybe just fill out a diary and say, oh yeah, my favorite morning show, I listen to Howard Stern every day and that's all I listen to. So they just write Howard Stern across every morning drive day part in their commute to work. But the reality was they were maybe listening to Howard and 2 other shows. So you saw the ratings spread out a little bit more. So there was a little bit of ratings erosion for everybody there, and rating compression.
You've got competitive pressures that, like any sales industry or like any competitive sales environment, you have pressures that are causing the industry as a whole. Would you say that potentially it's causing the industry to, is this more of a commodity-based environment?
Yeah, so it absolutely is growing to more of a commodity-based sale, which can be unfortunate because not all ratings are created equally. Like when you look at the format of different radio stations and who those listeners are, they represent different people, but every business is competitive and every business is trying to become more efficient and downsize on the people involved and to have more technology involved. And as that happens, you start to see automation and programmatic creep in. So anybody who's listening who has bought any type of digital media, it's usually done in a programmatic fashion. It's almost like a self-serve. You can go on to Google and anybody can buy, search and make sure they have like certain keywords. That's all done by one person clicking a few buttons of the mouse. Radio and traditional media, legacy media like radio, TV, is, believe it or not, incredibly complicated to buy. There's a ton of back and forth that happens between the seller and the buyer, and you're looking at cost per points and cost per thousands and how much media is spilling into certain areas, and are you buying a region? Are you buying the country? What's the market like? There's a lot of supply and demand, but now you're seeing people, that CPM model, that commoditized model, the revenue coming in from that side of it increases every year. It takes the salesperson out of the game a little bit.
When you say it takes them out of the game a little bit, because there's less relationship building and building awareness and trust. It's more of, what's your bottom line? What's your price? Is that what you mean by that?
Exactly. So relationships with that type of buying play less of a role because it's all price driven, and the number one station in the market is going to be measured the same way as the number 20 station in the market.
Meaning how many listeners did you bring?
Yeah. And what is the cost per thousand? What is the CPM of the listener on the number one station versus the listeners on the number 20 station? And just a quick little sidebar on that. I mean, think about it. If you can, or anybody listening can think of their favorite radio station, or even let's talk more broadly with audio. If you could think of your favorite podcast, if you're big into podcasting, whatever audio is.
Wait. If you could think of your favorite podcast, it's this podcast right here. Now, hold on a second here. Everybody listening in, when you're thinking of your favorite podcast, it's Selling with Social. Okay, go ahead, Rafe.
Yeah, so speaking of myopic lenses, so that is a very personal, intimate relationship. People will always say, my radio station. They take ownership. It's mine, my favorite podcast, my station. And, especially with the morning show where there's a lot more personality and talk driven radio, even for music formats, like the radio personalities that are on in the morning, they're engaging their listeners in a different way. They're having that conversation that I kind of alluded to in the vehicle, and they develop a relationship. So there's an emotion there. And we all know any kind of marketing, any type of purchase, it's all emotionally driven. We're emotional creatures. So you can't tell me that the rating point on that number one station with the powerful and emotionally driven morning show, that connection that morning show has on the top station with their listener, compared to the morning show that might not even exist on the number 20 station, that could be syndicated and might have a show that is not even in the hometown of the person that's listening, or they're maybe it's just all music that gets into like Pandora and Spotify. That's not the same kind of emotional connection. So the environment of the commercial is so different. And this is why an endorsement spot, an endorsement commercial is so valuable and is the premium and is usually first in the commercial break, is because it has that emotional connection, because you're getting the credibility of the radio personality telling you about the product. They're vouching for it. they're maybe talking longer than 30 seconds or 60 seconds. There's so many reasons why that's valuable. And that's an emotion that's not represented on a cost per point or a rating or a cost per thousand. So when it becomes a commodity, it cheapens it and you're not getting the full picture. I mean, what do you think about that, Mario?
What I think is a question. And the question is given everything that you just said, talk to me about, I mean, look, there are many industries that we work with, whether it's technology or B2B professionals, professional consulting services, or whatever it might be, insurance. There are many, many industries where it's commodity-based sales, right? Where there's many options to choose from, and it requires salespeople and sales leaders to do things different. They still have to create disruption. They still have to innovate. They still have to build relationships. Talk a little bit about how does a sales leader or a salesperson in a hyper-competitive environment, which is what you just described. If I'm not mistaken, you described what I would consider a hyper-competitive environment, yeah?
Very much so, yes.
So how does a sales leader or a salesperson create still disruption and innovate and win business in a hyper-competitive environment? And it can't be just because you have the lowest price.
You mentioned relationships earlier, and I don't care how much of a commodity sale you have. Relationships are still going to play a role to one degree or another. And I think that's still going to be one of the most important aspects of a sale. It's how do you make yourself interesting? How do you make yourself stick out? How do you make yourself different? I mean, how do you build your brand? One of the reasons why I wanted to come on your show is because I like the idea of getting exposure to my brand as an individual to you and your audience. And that's valuable to me. You know, what you're doing with your podcast and reaching out to the sales community, you're building your brand. You're interacting with the highest level salespeople that exist in the country. You're sharing best practices. You're constantly learning. So I think building your brand and sharing best practices and learning is a huge way to do that, to separate yourself from all the competition out there. I'm happy to share some examples of how
absolutely.
I do that. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, and I'm going to talk about wine. And the reason why I'm going to talk about wine is because I love wine. It's something I'm passionate about. And I would encourage anybody to just look within yourself and think about what you're passionate about, because passion sells. Talk about emotions. Like, emotions are what is going to motivate you and other people. So I figured out a way to incorporate wine into my media life. And I wanted to figure out ways to have face-to-face interaction and connections with people. This was even before I had my wine label. And I was going up against, I mentioned iHeartMedia before. I was working for a much smaller media company and going up against iHeartMedia, who does the iHeart Festival every year. And, and they've got Bob Pittman, who's like going around on his private jet at the time. And, he's got a yacht and taking people to like Cannes Film Festival. And he's doing the iHeartMedia Festival in Vegas. And, it's this massive party, backstage access. And they're spending millions of dollars just on like T&E. And here I am, I'm with a company that can't even come close to that. iHeartMedia, their revenue is a few $1 billion a year. The company I was with at the time was only $100 million. So our T&E was a fraction of that. So I needed to get creative, and I created an event, and it became an annual event where I would just take 20 of my key buyers. I was in the suburbs of Philadelphia at the time. I would go up to New York, where all the money was, mostly the majority of the money, especially for Philly at the time, was coming out of New York, like 80% of the national revenue. So I had to go where my bread was buttered. And I took 20 of my key buyers and a few of my key sellers, and I took them out to Long Island vineyards, and we did a wine tour. And it was an amazing, intimate experience. And I took it one step further, where I took a picture of everybody at the end of the wine trip. We had a great day, 3 wineries. Everybody was well overserved, as you can imagine. So we took a picture at the end, and I followed up that wine tour, which was in September, great time of year to be out in North Fork with the weather. And I took that picture and I put it on the label of a bottle of wine, and I used it as a gift for those same people and some other people around the holiday season. So now you have that amazing memory. It lives on with the bottle of wine. And the funny thing that I came to see and realize was that I wanted them to drink the wine, but they didn't really drink it because they loved the memory so much and they thought the bottle was so cool. They kept it on their desk. And there's a saying in the business where it's like, if you own the buyer's desk, you own the buyer. So it's like they had this amazing memory on their desk that was constantly a reminder of what we did, the time we shared together. I made sure it was all people that got along. It was great people. It was a great group. And then it created this other buzz where people who saw the wine on the desk said, hey, where's that bottle from? What's that? What did you guys do? And it's like, oh, I went on Rafe's wine tour. Then this annual event became known as like Rafe's wine tour, and people wanted to go, and it grew from there. And I can maybe even say that maybe was like the germination of the wine label that I now have. And I'm definitely known as like the wine guy, kind of with like, my circle of people in the media industry. And that's just something that makes me different. Maybe people think it's interesting. Maybe people think it's boring, but it's just something different that I can bring to the table. Because at the end of the day, when we are spending time with the people we do business with, we don't always want to be talking about business. You want to be able to get to know someone on a real level, and you're not going to have those conversations in a business environment. That's why we do dinners. That's why we do drinks. That's why we do sporting events or whatever it is to get those moments. I'm lucky where I've been with companies that have been associated with like some big events like the Super Bowl or the Masters, and to be able to take people to those events and to really spend quality time, that's definitely a point of differentiation. So for the people listening, it's like whatever you have at your disposal, whether it's a part of your company or something you can create, especially if it's something that you can create that you have passion about, like I have passion about wine, then I would encourage you to do that and figure out a way to bring in maybe some of your favorite hobbies or the hobbies of the people you do business with, which I think is also really important, getting to know the decision makers and what they love. And if you love what they love, and if you can help them find that little like piece of happiness, this is not only a good recipe for developing relationships in business, it's just a good recipe for developing relationships in life. It's just listening to people, it's caring about what they care about. So not to dive too deep down that rabbit hole, but that to me is a huge point of differentiation and how you can separate yourself from competition and make yourself also a little bit more interesting to the people you work with.
So in my hand, those of you who are obviously can't see me and Rafe in person, but in my hand, I've got this, these are cards. And our CMO, Bernie Borges, just ordered these cards. He said, I'm shipping a box of whatever it was, 300, or I don't know what the number is, 500, something like that, to you for use. And I said, why? And he said, well, for obvious reasons. I said, what's the obvious reason? And he said, to say thank you. And I said, I could just send an email. And he said, yeah, and so can everyone else, right? And so can everyone else, right? And so I was like, crap, you're right. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Like, if you think about this, when was the last time that I, as a buyer, received a handwritten note from someone who sold to me? Mm-hmm. I can't even think of one. I cannot even think of an occasion where someone sent me a handwritten note. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out a way where I can make it look like I wrote the note, but actually just like stick it on there and then just sign it.
You're trying to automate it.
I'm trying to automate it, baby. I'm trying to automate it. But he was right? I mean, you think about this. Every time you engage with somebody, send them that handwritten note. It's funny. On another note, I was calling a buyer, and they picked up the phone and they said, Mario? And I said, yes. And they said, wait, you're calling me the digital guy? And I'm like, of course I'm calling you. The phone isn't broke, is it? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Not to interpret Verizon, but can you hear me now? So, going back to what you said in terms of, in an ultra competitive commodity-based environment, and I used to work for a telecom organization, which we did both wireless and wireline. And on the wireless side, it's an ultra commodity-based environment, right? So why did we continue to renew big, giant $30+ million contracts with these corporations? And it was exactly as you described, right? It was the small things. For example, whenever I traveled, I would meet with the executives and do dinner with them. We would arrange baseball games, outings, or events, right? It's those small things. Another one, we just recently had some guests on a webinar that we did. And all three executives, I sent a handwritten note to, which was, by the way, Bernie Borges' idea. I went out and bought a card bought a card, and I was thinking in the store, gosh, I don't want to, come on. It took me like 35 minutes to do all this, 3 cards, 3 different notes, and I sent them 3 different sets of gifts that we had that with, Vingresso memorabilia. And, some of the things that I think about when I was a seller and a sales leader was when marketing handed over to me stuff that would said, here's your tchotchkes. Some of these things were like stupid stuff, right?
I know what you mean.
And so every time we buy something, I'm all about practicality. And I can't even find it right now. But recently, someone sent me a Swiss Army knife as a promo. And I thought, well, that's pretty cute. And that's nice to have. But when do I ever carry a Swiss Army knife? Like I wouldn't use that. But here's what I do have. People can't see it. Here we go. Right here, I've got this little white thing right here that says Vingresso. What is that? What is this little white thing? This is a battery charger for my mobile phone and my iPad. And this is one that we decided to spend the money on because guess what? If I give this to you, you're likely going to use it. When do you need how often do you need to recharge your cell phone, Rafe?
All the time. I'm always looking for like an outlet to charge. I mean, I'm on the road all the time and I'm on my phone, killing my battery. Sometimes it'll be like 10:30 in the morning, and I'm like, I've got a new phone.
Exactly.
Like, how's my battery already down to like 25%?
That's exactly right. So, even if you're in a commodity-based sales environment, I think the key point that I'm trying to portray here is go back to your marketing department. You're a sales leader and say, stop with buying that stupid tchotchke crap that nobody's going to use. They're just going to take and toss, or they're going to come back and give it to their kids or something like that, right? Give them something that they will use and they will see your brand every freaking time that they use it. And if you can find something on a daily basis, every person that I've given this mobile device charger to this day, I get notes saying, man, I use that every single day, right? Every single day. And guess what? My brand is in front of them and they'll remember me. So I think those are some important elements that people, if you're selling in a commodity-based environment or a hyper-competitive environment, in order to create disruption, you personally, as the salesperson, I think what I'm getting out of this conversation, Rafe, is you personally, as the salesperson, need to think of ways that creates disruption and that innovates in terms of building a relationship with the buyer. Would you agree?
Absolutely, hands down, 100%. I mean, I'm sure there's a ton of ideas we could talk about. The people listening probably have a lot of great ideas of their own that they've used. I'd love to actually know what they are. If your listeners share some of those ideas with you, it would be great to see them because the more best practices we can share, the better.
Yeah. Now, we're almost up here on time. There was something that you mentioned to me that I thought, man, it's such a great point that we as sales leaders need to be thinking about, especially when we're in a hyper-competitive environment or we're below quota or we need to hit the quota, hit the number. One of the things you said to me was about managing a team up and not measuring the individual to your personal 100%, but to their personal 100%.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, everybody's 100% is different. And as long as you're getting as close to that 100% as possible from every single salesperson as often as possible, then I think you as a manager, you are doing your job. And like you just mentioned, knowing that their 100% is different than your 100%, and maybe their 100% is way more than I could ever do or you could ever do, which would be great. But a lot of sales leaders and sales managers, especially that are out there, we're typically really good salespeople. So, like the easy mistake, and I know I made it when I got into management in the beginning, I'm thinking, okay, well, if I could just turn everybody on this team into what I was doing and into me.
It's me, exactly.
Yeah, because I am so great and amazing. If I could turn them all
wonderful, Rafe.
Yeah. Like the ego really plays a huge role there. And then that's just a recipe for failure because you're always going to be disappointed. No one is going to work as hard as you maybe did to get to where you are. And guess what? Maybe they don't want to. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as they're doing their job and giving you 100% and you know what that is, then that's a win. And I think it's also equally important to know if they actually are reaching their 100% and what that skill level is. And looking at it almost like a baseball team or a football team, whatever it is, you're going to have role players. And you know what? For the baseball analogy, not everybody's going to be a cleanup hitter. Not everybody's a 3 or 4 hitter. You have like those 8 and 9 hitters in the lineup, and that's all part of the team, and it's all necessary. And every sales team is going to have some role players that are maybe specializing in certain types of sales or certain accounts that they really do well in and focus just on those accounts. So as long as they're giving 100% in those areas, then I think you're doing a job, and you're not going to set yourself up for a lot of frustration and set them up for failure and create what can really be a toxic environment if you're getting on people with unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, valid point. Listen, man, I've enjoyed this conversation, and you opened my eyes to not everything is all about San Francisco, a proper Bay Area. Revolve around the urban San Francisco, New York area. But if someone wants to get a hold of you, they want to connect with you, what's the best way? Is that, LinkedIn, Twitter? What's the best way to connect up with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I try and stay active on LinkedIn. So that would probably be the best way to get me. Please do send me a message when you do. If you're going to reach out from this show, put, the story of sales, Vengresso in there, and put Mario in there, just something that lets me know so I can filter it from some of we all know we get dinged a lot on LinkedIn from people trying to sell stuff. A lot of times they're people like us. I love to engage with people. I love what you're doing. I love what you're all about. So I hope we get a chance to continue the conversation.
Well, we'll put Rafe's LinkedIn profile in the show notes, but it's RAF as in Frank E. DAMICO, D'Amico. So make sure you connect with him and say you heard him on Selling with Social podcast. So Rafe, I got one last question for you, man, before we got to cut out of here. And that is your all-time favorite movie. What is it?
That is such a hard question. I mean, first movie that comes to mind is like Godfather, just because it's so great. But I mean, I how about this? I can tell you my favorite writer-director, and that's Paul Thomas Anderson. He's done some great films like Boogie Nights, Magnolia. I love his work. So I'll go with PTA, Paul Thomas Anderson.
I love it. All right. Well, there you go. There you have it on Selling with Social. For those of you listening in, thank you so much for being loyal listeners. Rafe, congratulations again on being the Global Sales 100 leader for the Modern Sales Magazine in 2019. Hey, thanks for listening to the Selling with Social Sales podcast. Did you enjoy that show? If so, would you do me a huge favor and give the Selling with Social podcast a rating and review on iTunes? That would be super awesome. Also, if you want to easily find our show, just go to vengresso.com. That's VENGRESO.com and click on podcast. From there, you'll find the Selling with Social podcast. Thanks for listening in. And until the next show, be awesome. Mario Martinez Jr.